Well, he's a lot more like everybody else than anyone thinks.
Putin calls NATO's bluff and mobilizes for World War III. In this video, we're going to look at Piers Morgan's interview with Jordan Peterson about the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. We're going to ask, would we even be able to recognize war propaganda if we saw it? And stick with me to the end of this video, and we're going to look at what we think Putin's next move will be. You're not going to want to miss it.
You know, the notion that he's Hitler or Stalin, that's just foolish. I don't see any evidence for that at all. I mean, first of all, Hitler and Stalin were very singular types, and there's a bit of Hitler and Stalin in everyone, so, you know, there's some truth in that. Maybe there's more in the typical Russian leader
than normal. A bit of Hitler in everyone? Really?
There's more than a bit.
Really?
Winston Churchill famously said that history is written by the victors. It's easy to think that someone like Hitler is so monstrous that in no way could we ever consider ourselves vaguely similar in terms of evil. But Peterson takes the opposite view and warns that we have to guard ourselves against the pride of concluding that we're so much different and better than Hitler.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, well, why would have Nazism spread the way it did? You know, people think, well, that's all top down. It's not top down. There's a part of people that are all these people who informed on Kate Goebells.
Well, didn't Goebells say that the way to get vast numbers of people to go along with what you want to do is to terrify them?
Of all the people he could have mentioned, of all the sinister, dark exponents and wizards of war propaganda, it's very interesting that Piers Morgan should reference Joseph Goebbels and what he said back in the late 1930s in order to persuade the German population to support Nazism and later the German war effort. Goebbels said, "Think of the press as a great keyboard on which the government can play." Goebbels said, "It is the absolute right of the state to supervise the formation of public opinion." He said, "Propaganda works best when those who are being manipulated are confident that they are acting on their own free will." Now, call me naive, but I would be surprised if Piers doesn't know that Goebbels said these things. Let's not forget, this is the same Piers Morgan who was branded a hypocrite for attending a packed football match just days after slamming the government for easing coronavirus restrictions. Piers also said anyone who does not accept the COVID vaccine should be banned from receiving NHS treatment. He said that. That's in spite of data showing boosted Americans seem to be getting more infections. Piers is also doubtless aware of Goebbels' other famous quote, which was, "Let me control the media and I will turn any nation into a herd of pigs." So I am left wondering why he mentioned Goebbels unless he was somehow entranced or mesmerized by his power to subjugate the masses. Maybe that isn't true, but maybe it is, given his proven track record of parroting government propaganda to his audience to the exclusion of all else.
Goebbels say that the way to get vast numbers of people to go along with what you want to do is to terrify them.
Yeah, you can
hold
do
a grip of terror over them.
Oh, yeah, but...
And in a way, that's what Putin's now doing with the Russian people, where he's going back now into a position of they're all trying to get us, they want to attack us, they want to take us over. He's terrifying his people to rally support for what at the moment is a conflict he has started, which is not going the way he assumed.
Well, the most, what would you say, the wisest commentators on totalitarian states, like Solzhenitsyn, and many psychological commentators, Jung was a good example of that, made a very straightforward case that you can't have a totalitarian state unless every single person is willing to lie about everything all the time. And you can think about that as top down because the leaders lie too. And they also enforce punishments if you don't lie. But then you can also think about it, the totalitarian spirit is replicated at every level of the society. And so in a truly totalitarian state, husbands lie to their wives and parents lie to their children. And the totalitarian state is actually the grip of the lie. And so, and people will certainly go along with that. I mean we're seeing that emerge here with cancel culture. It's like lie or else.
Yes.
It's like, yeah, well.
And the Russian people will be bombarded all the time with state media propaganda and will be buying into a lot of what Putin is saying.
Yeah.
Piers mentions how the Russian population is being bombarded with state propaganda as though he is revealing to us that if it wasn't for that pesky Russian state media, then it wouldn't be possible for Putin to lie and indoctrinate his people and to perpetuate the thuggery and murder which has characterized his 8-month campaign in the Donbass. But let's not forget that back in February, Liz Truss was imploring UK citizens to go over to Ukraine themselves and fight, even though at the time her fellow ministers warned her in no uncertain terms that this represented nothing less than illegal invasion of a sovereign territory. You can't just go abroad and start randomly murdering Russian people. That's insane. And now she's the Prime Minister.
And absolutely, if people want to support that struggle, I would support them in doing that. So you support? Absolutely, if that's what they want to do. I do support that. And of course, that is something that people can make their own decisions.
And once they have made a decision to fight for Ukraine, they can either be deployed on a suicide mission or shot. That old chestnut. Thanks, BBC. The BBC is, of course, the UK's state propaganda arm. You can't even watch the BBC unless you pay an annual licence fee of £160, which the government still hasn't scrapped. So in exchange for that money, you get the now UK Prime Minister giving you a direct recommendation, if you're a man, to lay down your life in a foreign country with no possible discernible upside benefit to anyone in the process. If that isn't state propaganda, what in hell's name is?
So you support? Absolutely, if that's what they want to do.
She makes literally zero attempt, and has done ever since then, to broker any kind of peace whatsoever in this region. Clearly, she wouldn't be the UK Prime Minister right now had she followed her own advice and gone out there and volunteered. Liz Truss claimed that this was a battle for democracy, when in reality, a democracy is quite obviously the worst and most contemptible possible form of government imaginable. Socrates hated it. He said that people who lack an understanding of politics should not vote. They can easily be manipulated. Socrates wasn't an elitist in the normal sense. He didn't believe that only a narrow few should ever be able to vote. He did, however, insist that only those who had bothered to consider bothering to think about issues rationally and deeply should ever be let near a vote. In the dialogues of Plato, the founding father of Greek philosophy, Socrates, is portrayed as hugely pessimistic about the whole business of democracy. In Book 6 of the Republic, Plato describes Socrates falling into conversation with a character called Adiamantus and trying to get him to see the flaws of democracy by comparing a society to a ship. If you were heading out on a journey by sea, asks Socrates, who would you ideally want deciding who was in charge of the vessel? Just anyone, or people educated in the rules and demands of seafaring? The latter, of course, says Adiamantus. So why then, responds Socrates, do we keep thinking that any old person should be fit to judge who should be ruler of a country? Socrates' point is that voting in an election is a skill, not a random intuition, and like any skill, it needs to be taught systematically to people. Letting the citizens vote without an education is as irresponsible as putting them in charge of a ship sailing to a Greek island in a storm. And you might even go further and say that today, politicians who have got no observable marketable skills are themselves about as effective at maritime navigation as a captain with no arms.
I've compiled a hit list of oligarchs, people who...
Is Abramovich on it?
I'm not going to say who is on the list, but what I can tell you is there are over 100 billionaires in Russia. We have compiled a hit list of oligarchs. We're working through and putting the cases together. And every few weeks, we will sanction new oligarchs.
Governments are pulling off a major, profound theft here. They've been violating international law, robbing individual Russians who have no connection to Ukraine, on the pretense that this will somehow put pressure on Putin to leave Ukraine. But the US has been funding the civil war against Russian Ukrainians in the Donbass for the last 8 years. The real question here is, have these politicians suddenly decided to use Ukraine as the excuse to justify confiscating money from randomly selected individuals, regardless of who owns that money?
What I can tell you is there are over 100 billionaires in Russia.
Seriously, total abandonment of private property rights while soliciting public support for another NATO offensive that not one single solitary citizen ever voted for. But that's fine, let's just all keep on living our lives as though this isn't utterly and unbelievably outrageous. I mean, there seems to be an apparent, almost ownerless view now of money emerging, especially in Europe, where these governments are just grabbing people's cash at will, abandoning any possible pretense of the rule of law. Just like Justin Trudeau in Canada confiscating people's accounts because they supported the truckers, we seem to be entering a completely wholesale collapse. in the very foundation of law upon which civilization has been sustained for at least the last 200 plus years. And this is always what happens when governments collapse and die. This confiscation of private Russian accounts and assets on the dubious and highly questionable theory that a foreign person having money must be suspicious since their country is doing something that offends a neighbouring country whose corruption is in and of itself well documented. But of course, the moment we talk about that, we discredit our false narrative, so we have to keep quiet about that particular form of corruption. Isn't that right, BBC? How else can you demonize innocent foreigners? How is the way that the Western media is treating Russians any different to how Germans treated the Jews in the 1940s? It all goes beyond being insane and unjustifiable. It's the complete and total, undeniable, irretrievable collapse of Western civilization happening before our very eyes. And this nonsense appears only just to be getting started as we head into 2023. Just looking at Europe, savers and investors have been abused with negative interest rates since 2014. Their assets have been devalued for years. And now with inflation at 10% in Europe, there is complete drastic destruction of European capital. Why would anybody want to invest in this horrifyingly despicable country known as the United Kingdom now? Its demise is as assured as it is deserved. And it's my fault. I never stood up against these criminals. So we're reaping the promised rewards of the crippling apathy that has plagued us as a nation for so long. This idea that we can continue to vote in policies that give us free stuff and just kick the can down the road in terms of debt, never having to worry about repaying it. Well, we can't kick the can down the road anymore. The bill is due, and we cannot afford to pay it, and this is why they need a war, as an external distraction to take people's minds off the fact that the government has done nothing but mismanage the economy for the last 70 years. And it's the same in Canada, it's the same in the USA, it's the same in New Zealand, it's the same in Germany, it's the same in Australia. We're all screwed. There has to be a war in order to distract us from just how terrible all of these people are.
And yes, there will be an economic cost here in Britain.
Really? Steady on, Liz. It's almost as though you're dangerously close to admitting that there's a link between you making bad decisions and the UK economy being unbelievably awful. These people get into power by promising things that they can only deliver by first stealing from other people. Government doesn't produce anything in and of itself. This is why we're completely screwed. So when Truss came out and said we need to lower taxes, while she was correct, the IMF reflexively started defecating all over itself. And now what's she done? She sacked Kwarteng and installed Jeremy Hunt, the WEF puppet, as her new chancellor, meaning that corporation tax will go up again and the standard of living for everybody will go down. And this will not help the economy improve. The problem is not how much tax money the Treasury collects. The problem is how much money the government spends. And cutting spending doesn't just mean taking an axe to public services. It also means eliminating vast numbers of public sector non-jobs that do nothing but drain taxpayer money. The problem, though, is that the people in these public sector jobs have voting power, and they are not going to vote for themselves not to have a job anymore or not to claim a state pension for the rest of their lives. So the idea that you can easily and with simplicity cut the size and power of the state once you get into power can immediately be dismissed as insane. This is very difficult. The only way that we're going to get anywhere is if the government is allowed to collapse. Trade openness, far lower in the UK than in other countries following Brexit. We were supposed to have improved trade as a result of leaving the EU. It looks like as though the opposite has happened. Not that I'm supporting the EU. Also, the UK has got the worst growth of all of the G7 countries, or is projected to have that. We've got a lack of investment in businesses, mainly because banks turn down almost 80% of small business loan applications. We also have a cultural deficit where fewer people are visiting museums and sites of interest. Add to that a broken supply chain, and we've also got a record number of people awaiting NHS treatment and massive debt which can never possibly be repaid, and an enormous looming energy crisis. Apart from that, everything's fine.
I don't know what the preconditions for peace might be, but I do know that naive notions that the Russians are going to lose somehow, or that we're going to win, I just don't understand. I don't understand that. Well, what do you mean we're going to win? What are we going to win here exactly?
Well, I guess a victory would be that the Russians retreated from Ukraine.
With Ukraine in ruins.
Russia's Secret Service arrested 8 people after the Crimean bridge bombing, and Putin had this to say in the wake of what he called a terrorist attack. Listen.
Проведения на нашей территории терактов, ответы со стороны России будут жесткими и по своим масштабам будут соответствовать уровню угроз, создаваемых Российской Федерацией. Ни у кого не должно быть Никаких в этом сомнений.
There was no doubt, of course, who had carried out these missile strikes. Today, Russia's armed forces have inflicted a massive strike with high-precision long-range weapons against Ukrainian military, communications and energy targets, the Russian Defense Ministry said in its daily briefing. The goal of the strike has been achieved. All designated targets were hit, it added.
The victory would be that the Russians retreated from Ukraine.
With Ukrainian ruins. Well, okay, fine, that's a hell of a victory. Like, I think Putin could manage that because I think he could tell his people, and I think they might buy it. It's like, we accomplished our objective. We devastated Ukraine and we kept it out of the hands of the West. And that's not great. It's not what we had hoped for, but it's better than the alternative. And I think they would buy that. And I think when Putin went into Ukraine, I thought a bunch of things, which I made a YouTube video about that. People criticized like mad. I thought, okay, well, what's happening here? Oh, I see. His end game for failure is that Ukraine is left in a smoking ruin. Oh, that's a victory. So then he can lose with impunity.
Right.
So how can we win? We can't win against Vladimir Putin anyways, because you cannot win against someone you cannot say no to. Period. And we can't say no to Putin because we sold our soul for his oil and gas. And we did that to elevate our moral stature in relationship to saving the planet. And so here we are, facing a very dire winter, hoisted on the petard of our own foolishness and moral presumption. We're saving the planet. We'll see. I don't think so. It doesn't look like it to me. And this is the most catastrophic issue here. Assuming that we're facing an environmental crisis of planetary proportions, which is not something I buy, by the way, assuming we are, well, then I would imagine that you would put in place measures that would ameliorate that problem instead of exacerbating it. But all the measures you're putting in place are actually making the environmental problem worse. So how is that even vaguely acceptable? And I look at that and I think, oh, I see. It's just like George Orwell said about middle-class socialists 50 years ago. It's not that you love the planet, it's that you hate humanity. So, well, have at her, boys and girls, and we'll see what happens this winter. And it's very terrifying to me.
It is.
Especially here, because your energy prices have gone way out of control, and that's going to hurt a lot of poor people, and certainly around the world as well. The World Bank already estimated that we've put 350 million people into what they call food insecurity. 350 million. That's 3 times as many as the communists managed to kill. Maybe we can manage that in a winter. But the planet has too many people on it anyway, so, that's just poor people.
So it might sound like Jordan Peterson is offering a very tongue-in-cheek response there, but it's remarkably close to the truth, everything that he's saying. It's not really covered in Western media, but it's rumored that up to 100,000 Ukrainians have been killed so far during the conflict with Russia. That's an enormous number of people. It's also rumored that NATO is paying members of ISIS and Al-Qaeda to join with the Ukrainian forces in order to fight against the Russians. That sounds outrageous, but there's evidence for this. There's a YouTube channel called Redacted, I would encourage you to watch, in which they discuss this in more depth. Essentially, supplying arms to Ukraine instead of trying to work a peaceful resolution out to this conflict is nothing less than an invitation to world war. And this is what the UK is doing now. Shipping off cruise missile interceptors, which are laser guided. I mean, this is an invitation to nuclear war. Unless this is a willful attempt by the British government and MI6 to kill as many people as possible, the strategic approach that the UK and NATO is taking towards this conflict doesn't make any sense to me at all. I mean, Russia knows what the hell's going on here. They know that this isn't a pure war against Ukraine. The German Foreign Ministry has confirmed that Russia bombed the building housing the German consulate in Kyiv earlier the other day. I mean, that's a warning. They're supplying weapons on a grand scale from Germany into Ukraine. So effectively, Germany's also declared war on Russia. Apparently, there was a meeting between Belarus and Russia in June 2022, in which it was agreed that Russia would transfer Iskander-M missiles that can carry both conventional and nuclear warheads into Belarus. Belarus is upgrading its Su-25 fighters in order that they can carry nuclear weapons. This is serious horse crap. I mean, nobody knows this stuff in any depth. I've looked in. I do nothing but look into all this geopolitical stuff because it takes precedence over pretty much every other possible topic we could discuss. Why should I sit around telling you about different groups of shares or companies that you can invest in? There may not be a world in which you can invest in companies if this nonsense doesn't stop escalating. I mean, Belarus knows the hatred of the Ukrainians towards Russia. They're going to have no choice but to restore nuclear arms in Belarus as well. I mean, this is really not going to end well at all. The next year looks seriously horrifying. I don't know whether or not there's going to be outright nuclear war just yet, but maybe tactical nukes could be used in the next few months. Kyiv was the origin of the Rus who became the Russians. This is why Putin hasn't tried to conquer Ukraine. He's only wanted to take control of the Donbass and seize control of the Donbass. But the hardliners who are criticizing Putin behind the scenes are demanding retribution against Ukraine. And Putin's been stepping up the attacks ever since this Crimean bridge attack. If he doesn't, then he will be overthrown. It's as simple as that. Somebody more hardline than Putin would come into power and absolutely go ballistic. God help us if that happens. Maybe this is what NATO wants. They just need to wipe out a couple of 100 million so that we don't have any more pensions to pay to people. It sounds insane, but this is always what happens. When countries are about to collapse because of debt, which they always do throughout history without exception, they start a war with an external enemy, real or imaginary. It's never not happened throughout history. Why all of a sudden would we be any different this time around? Anyway, I'm going to stop ranting. I do hope you've enjoyed this. Let me know what your thoughts and comments are. I know it's perhaps a little bit more thought-provoking than normal, but I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope to speak to you soon. And if you've got any more topics you want me to cover, then let me know. Thank you.